like we've got Hussain and Morgan and Jess and Sarrah. So why don't we get started? So welcome to the meeting. This is Saturday, of course. And this week we had two meetings. We had the DevoWorm meeting and we had the open source meeting finally. So we had our first open source meeting of the year. And so check those out on YouTube. The DevoWorm meeting is on the DevoWorm YouTube, and the open source meeting is on the Orthogonal Lab YouTube. Okay, and so we had a lot of good discussions there. Sarrah presented on her project. So what we're going to do in the open source meeting is people will present their open source activities, ideas, whatever. And then, we'll kind of work on debugging things, keeping track of progress, trying things out and other things like that. And then we'll have features where we talk about different topical themes. And then Hussain also presented on some of the work that he's been doing. So thanks to both Hussain and Sarrah for, contributing to that meeting. And as for the DevoWorm group, the DevoWorm meeting, I went over some information about a workshop I attended where they were building what they call the minimal cell. So this is where we have just the components of what the Craig Venter Institute calls the minimal bacterial cell. So it's like where they strip out all the genes that aren't necessary for survival, and they get the genome down to a minimal number of genes that can allow the thing to still be alive. And then they model all of the different components. So there are no organelles in a bacterial cell. You have DNA, you have different types of DNA related things like proteins and ribosomes and things like that. You have water, and you have the outer membrane of what they call vesicle. And so modeling all that. And it was very different from the CompuCell 3D stuff we've talked about, very different from some of the other stuff that we've talked about in terms of modeling, like gene regulatory networks and that. Interestingly, though, they were doing some work with Blender and Minecraft. So doing the 3D modeling aspect of it. And you can get 3D modeling, from microscopy images, from tomographic images, from other types of data that allow you to actually reconstruct that in a 3D model. So it's kind of interesting stuff. And then, of course, there's the OpenWorm stuff, which is, where you're modeling cells in a body of a worm. So you have the wall of the body wall, you have muscle, you have the cell bodies and things like that. So it's a very different type of modeling, but I just wanted to get a good diversity of different types of models that people try to do. And, there are two different kind of ways you can do this. You can either model everything down to, say, like the atomic scale, and people do that. But the problem with that, of course, is that there's, you spend a lot of computational time in building these kind of models, and every molecular interaction or atomic interaction costs you a certain amount of computation. So if you want to model something like a cell, that's going to make it very hard to do. And especially like over time, because, biology happens over time. So you have to sort of approach the scale of the problem, or coarser, fine-grain the problem appropriately so that you can get the kind of simulation you want. You can ignore the details that are maybe extraneous, and, be able to collect data that will allow you to build an informed model that does things that are sort of the things you would expect in nature to happen. So, we don't want to build a model that doesn't do anything that an actual biological system does. So, so we're approaching that in DevoWorm, and I hope maybe in the coming weeks we can maybe talk a little bit more about CompuCell 3D and, kind of dig into what they do and how that can be used to model processes and systems. So That's all about our weekly activities. We had to sort of put aside the cognition futures and cybernetics reading group until like sort of the end of this month, which is fine. Um, but we're still working on our readings and some of the things there. Um, so now I'd like to ask for updates if people have them. So I know Jess is traveling, so if you want to say something in the chat, that's fine. Otherwise, I'll open the floor to anyone who wants to give an update.
I'll just briefly, you kind of mentioned some things. Yeah, I'm putting Condition Futures, the reading group, on hold, essentially until we get more into June. I'm just going to have way too much going on as I finish out sort of the most intense term. So I just think it's the right thing to do for that. Definitely looking forward to continuing that. I just need to take a break to finish off all the other stuff going on. And yeah, I'm also looking forward to continuing the cybernetics group. I think we left off with the anticipatory system stuff.
Yeah.
So that's good stuff too. My general updates are a lot of work has been happening with Joe Pro and related stuff. Jen was at the open source meeting, and is sort of helping with Google Summer Code, but also that's going to dovetail into things for the lab at large. So that's it's nice to have that support, and it'll take a while, but I think we'll have some useful things for the lab. That said, Joe Pro stuff. I'm really trying to reorganize a lot of things with Joe Pro, and it's just taking time, but I'm pretty happy with it. The DSM project is still ongoing too, and I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to dovetail some things with stuff in my program or not. I may have some opportunities to do some data kinds of analysis for a project, but I think it might not work out. We'll see. I'm trying to, but for sure, I did not. I've completed the draft of the post for the Inclusive Gaming Conference, and I'm kind of reorganizing a bunch of my site things, but I will eventually publish that too, and it's something I will definitely go over in the lab as well for Condition Futures or just the DSM project, whatever we want to do with it. But I think that continues to be. I've been thinking about that event quite a lot, both for what it was and for the connections that were made there. There's a lot of connections were made along the lines of both sort of there's like law students in the We Robot camp. We Robot's one of the things that I actually update about We Robot. Now that I'm thinking about it, unfortunately, I don't think it's happening quote unquote this year because it's been a fall event for the last few years, and we've done stuff with it. I think since 2022 when it was in Seattle, Washington. I believe that's the year it was out on the West Coast. I went to that and presented some stuff there. And then I was at last year's event too, here in Boston. But I was looking into it because I met a few colleagues, or I guess a few connections at the Connect Your Life event in Oxford, and one of them would be an amazing fit for We Robot. But I was like, hey, you should check out this conference, and that has not happened. But I've heard it just may be happening in the springtime. And I'm trying to find out who to talk to about it. They're like, hey, I would love to help or volunteer make it happen. Or at least, contribute positively to it. So unfortunately, no We Robot in the fall. It's usually been like September or something. But like I was saying before that, there's been some interesting people in law. I had an amazing conversation with people doing a lot of virtual reality, um, not just making the like a virtual reality world, but like trying to also create sort of a way to connect between them.
Mm.
I mentioned that before. I'll say more about that later. And then a number of people just doing like very deep philosophical work. I was so I don't know about you, but like when I hear someone properly use affordance in a kind of conference that's not about like ooh phenomenology directly or something of that nature, it always makes me smile. So like like two or three speakers, one of them's very into philosophy. The opening keynote, Dr. Poppy Wild, I believe, like has this book about like post-human gaming and um, really nice language about like the entanglement of identity and how like when you have a virtual avatar, it's kind of in between spaces. Like, is it us? Is it we? Is it me? Am I playing the game? Am I, is it my avatar? Like there's these things that happen to your sense of self, one depending on the nature of that. And I have a lot of other great points in the keynote, and just other people as well. That I go into detail with some of this, and it's a longer blog post, but I'm really excited for the post. Not just because the writing is fine, but also just because I think some connections from the event will both affect everything from society ethics tech group to maybe some aspects of Future Futures to definitely 100% plot twisters, which is the reason I was there. And another colleague or two was there from that group, and it was just a lot sort of percolating in that space. The only other thing, I guess, on the radar right now is, I guess there's a few things, but I'll just say, oh, what was it? Oh, I'm going to an event today. It's not super related to anything we're talking about directly, but it'll be essentially an Epilepsy Foundation event. And it's a smaller event, but I think there'll be some good things there. And I want to support some people in that space. And I'm really curious how I'm pretty familiar with certain regional events in New York, but I'm really curious. It's my first time seeing it in like the Massachusetts area, so we'll see how that goes. And I'll report back on that, depending on what we find. But those are my updates for now.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Jesse. Sounds like good stuff, as usual. Um, yeah, good luck at the event today, and you always get some good information out of these events. So keep up the good work. So yeah, we have Morgan said I can update a bit later if that's okay. That's fine. And then Sarrah says no major updates from my side. She did present at yesterday's meeting, so we have her update on her project and some of what she's thinking. Now she did post a blog post this week, and so for the Google Summer of Code community period, we are doing a number of activities which we covered last week and then in Friday's meeting. And so this is part of those activities is kind of doing this sort of real-time outreach where you're kind of keeping your notes together, you're publishing a blog post. We used to do this every week, but I don't know if it's required for the program, but I would suggest that uh, people doing Google Summer of Code or any kind of research try to do a regular blog post like that. So congratulations to Sarrah. So she published this blog post and doing some research for frameworks to use for her project. So she's trying to jumpstart her project, investigate the best approach to use. And so she's actually using or wants to use Petting Zoo, which is this Lang chain model from Petting Zoo. So we've talked about Petting Zoo in the past in the group. So using these Petting Zoo environments, which are like where you train a model in the environment. So it's training. It's like the AI gym, basically, where you're training the model in this environment. And then where you're using language chain agents powered by large language models. So that's an interesting step. So yeah, you did actually push that post to our Medium. So let me share my screen and show the Medium post. I just got it published before the meeting here. This is the post, multi-agent systems from reinforcement learning to large language models. So this is a literature review that Sarrah conducted for this area. So this is nice to have because, a lot of these areas, the literature is very fast moving, but that also means that people don't really review it. And, a lot of people have different strategies for keeping up with the machine learning literature, keeping up with all of that, but it's hard to really kind of get your hands around the major themes. So, you might have like they have archive sanity, tools like that, but those tools don't synthesize the literature. So I'm glad to see that we're getting some of that out of the as part of the community period. So imagine a team of robots, each with its own job. They're like players on a soccer field working together to score goals that none could achieve alone. So this is this multi-agent systems, sort of multi-agent reinforcement learning approach that people have been experimenting with. So, multi-agent reinforcement learning is reinforcement learning with multiple agents. Multiple agents have policies and they try to kind of synchronize their policies so that they can do these collective behaviors. And so people, of course, have studied collective behavior in different ways. And this is one way you can implement it using formalized policies on agents. And then this talks about sort of how this is all self-organized and that it's, I don't know if you would consider it to be leaderless, but it's very distributed. So each agent has its own sort of goals. And then there's a sort of a social goal that exists, where the agents have to solve a problem. And then they have to coordinate their behavior so that they have, they maybe there's some division of labor that emerges or there's some improvisation that emerges. But the point is that you can't, plan that out. It has to sort of synthesize spontaneously, and that's what you're trying to do in these kind of approaches. So, if you think about like swarming algorithms or other types of like collective behavior algorithms that people use, it's very similar to that. So they decide not only what their next move will be, but also who in the group will be the best partner for each task at hand, like choosing how you pass the ball during a crucial moment of the game. This ability to adapt and coordinate smoothly is vital to any world where multiple agents interact. And so, this coordination is the key. So you have to be able to sort of, the agents not only have to match the policies, but they have to know kind of what they're sort of how they're going to approach the policy without stepping on each other's toes. So it's kind of like a social insect collective where, they do have this division of labor and, they do certain things and it's very efficient in terms of carrying out the larger task. So that's what we're trying to do here. So she covers a couple of papers. This paper 1 uses sort of a probabilistic approach with reinforcement learning. So there's this Bayesian inference aspect to this sort of reinforcement learning problem. And they use this approach called Bayesian delegation, an algorithm developed by them that helps artificial agents infer the hiddens of others by inverse planning. So this is like, we had, I guess, Himanshu, who was in the meeting yesterday, he had a question about Viterbi algorithms and hidden Markov models with respect to this. So I think that's an interesting connection. And so you're dealing with these kind of hidden states or hidden variables within other agents that you can predict and then act upon and coordinate with. So that's, something that's one way to do this is to sort of infer those hidden states and then, act accordingly. Or predict what those hidden states will be at any given time and then act accordingly. So this is an interesting approach. They're doing these multi-agent MDPs, So, okay, so there's this. They're evaluating multi-agent collaborations in a two-dimensional grid world, which is this kitchen, where agents or which are chefs, work together to cook a recipe efficiently within a limited number of time steps. So they have to each have their own sort of. They have to achieve this recipe, and they have to figure out what they're going to do. So, what are the agents? What job are they going to do to achieve the larger goal of making this recipe? And they have to do it within a certain time because you can't do it in infinite time, obviously. So this models the problem as a multi-agent Markov decision process, or MMDP, where each state is defined by locations, statuses, and types and objects of all objects and agents. And then once you define those things, you have a transition function, which then models the probability of moving from one state to another. It's a very Markovian approach. Now, it's interesting because the stuff that we did on active inference for the open source sustainability project that used POMDP. So it's a similar approach where you're doing this Markovian modeling. And so we have this kind of a model, and people have done various different variations on this. So this is definitely an approach that we've kind of somewhat explored, but maybe not as much as we would like. And this might be, one way to do this, especially with respect to the open source sustainability, where you have a lot of people contributing, and they have to figure out where they fit into a larger project, and there's this sort of time imperative. You don't have infinite time to do things. You can't do things like 2 months later, because there's this time gap that occurs, and so you have to coordinate in time and in task space. So this is a graph here. I think there was a question about this, and you're sampling from the different tasks. So the agents are doing things during these different phases. So lettuce unchopped, tomato unchopped, tomato chopped, lettuce chopped, and then add the tomato, and then you have plate tomato chop, lettuce chop delivery. So you have to put all those together, and they happen in time, and they have to happen in a certain sequence. So yeah, and then the second paper is enter large language models for their ability to code. These are communicative agents for software development. These are the large language models using ChatDev. So this is where you're kind of training a large language model in a multi-agent environment. And then this third one is LLM-based agents to simulate human behaviors. So this is again using large language models for these generative agents, and they're kind of having a conversation, and they're doing these interactions. So this is all interesting stuff, and I'm glad that Sarrah was able to review all that for us. Thank you, Sarrah. And it looks like Shubham is here. Hello. So
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
So I just want to apologize for not attending yesterday's meet. I didn't move the timings, but I'll be joining from next week for sure.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, we were just reviewing our project. So in the Friday meetings, we're just gonna whoever I would kind of hope that everyone working on a project would kind of give a short update, and then if you want to do a larger update, you can, but you're not required to in any 1 week. I'd like to have people do like short, updates, like kind of a stand-up type thing, and then every couple weeks you do a larger update on what you're doing. So it's up to you though. So thank you, Shubham. Welcome, and thank you. Welcome, Himanshu. We were just talking about you. So thank you. Yeah, Sarrah says thanks a lot for presenting the blog. I don't know if people had thoughts about the blog post. Any interesting things that I didn't bring up? Okay. I think it's good. Definitely, a lot of things we've been talking about are in the project and in some of the other projects. especially with respect to agents and agent-based modeling and things like that. So yeah, and then we again for the Google Summer of Code community period, we're still in that period, so we have maybe another 10 days or so in that period. And my expectation there is that people, and even if you're not in Google Summer of Code, I think it's a good opportunity to sort of look over what's going on in the community here, and kind of take stock of what you could contribute to or what could help you achieve what you want to achieve. So we have a lot of content, like I think we talked about this yesterday. We have a lot of onboarding content. We have a lot of different things going on in the lab, and it's kind of hard to keep track of everything because there are different people doing different things, different streams, different projects, and it's very hard to be on top of all of that, and myself included, because I'm the one who's kind of helping this self-organize. So I would encourage people to go to the YouTube channel, to the GitHub repository, to the website, and explore those things and see if you find things that are interesting or parallel your own work or whatever. Okay. So if we don't have any more questions, I'm going to get into something feature I wanted to talk about. So let me share my screen again. And so, I've had this long-standing interest in city simulations and SimCity, and I've been collecting some things that have been coming out across my feed, across my, when I do research. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those things now. So I don't know how many people played SimCity. It's kind of a dated endeavor. The last version they had was like 10 years ago, and there was kind of a debacle around the release of that software. So it's something that is a long-standing tradition in computing. The first SimCity came out in the 1980s, and it was very good. Well, Morgan's played it, yeah. And the whole idea was that they wanted to simulate a city, because cities are actually good units of like social organization, self-organization. There are a lot of things going on in cities that are really interesting from a computational standpoint, because there are a lot of people doing urban planning. There are a lot of people who want to improve cities. They want to be able to monitor what's going on, and it's very hard to do if you don't understand the dynamics. So it's kind of like people who aren't necessarily interested in complex systems are interested in they can understand like a city and how it's self-organized, and if you talk to them about self-organization using a city as an example, they understand that pretty well. So but anyways, so one thing you can do, of course, is you can simulate a city in a computer, hopefully, like I just mentioned earlier. Oh, okay, Morgan said my mom was an urban planner, so I lived it. Yeah. So I talked earlier about kind of picking your sort of parameters, picking your scale for your model. If you're building, say, like a virtual cell, you want to have the right time scale, you want to have the right spatial scale, and you want to know what kind of computational resources you have to fulfill that. So if you have a very limited system, you can't just simulate everything and hope for the best. In SimCity, they had a certain way that they modeled a city. And then, that allowed you to build these simulations that could run for a long time, many days and nights as it was simulated in the machine. And, that's necessary in a city because you can't just simulate like 5 seconds or 10 seconds. You have to simulate long time periods. And so if you can do that, then you can get some really interesting dynamics that emerge. So, in SimCity, you'd have things like you'd have riots that would spontaneously start because the people who were the residents would not have water or not have police protection or something. If you didn't specify it in the model, there would be consequences for that. So then you'd have to specify it and everything else. So the way the SimCity model would work was that you'd have this sort of this, plain region, and it would be like a grid, and you'd have all these things that you could put on the grid. You could put roads, housing, you could put police stations, fire stations, whatever, schools, and then you would just let the simulation run, and there would be residents that would move in, and there would be activities that would unfold, and this would go on, and it would kind of capture its own dynamics. So you could put those things in place as initial conditions, run the simulation, and then if you walked away from the computer for a while and came back, you may not recognize what you came back to because it's been simulated so much that it has its own dynamics, and you'd have to respond to everything that's going on. So, they would give you alerts in the game, and you would be able to do that. Now, an interesting side note about this is that we've talked about some of these things in cybernetics, particularly like the work of Gordon Pask and the work of some of the people working with CyberSim, like Stafford Beer. So those, it's interesting that actually, if you read about the history of SimCity, it was in part inspired by the cyberneticists trying to do those things. They were trying to monitor very large systems that sometimes they were like national economies, sometimes they were firms that were really big corporations, and they're organizations that you can't necessarily get your hands around very easily. And they have their own dynamics that, you get lost in if you try to plan everything out by hand. And so that's where this came from, and putting this into a computer. And some people argue that you can't do this effectively. But, this is a debate that's gone on where, maybe we build a model that you can do this in, but it's not realistic enough because you have to sort of choose your units of analysis and the way you model the city that, maybe are not realistic. So Jay says, or Jess, I guess, also I found out Brian Eno knew cybernetics in Conway's Game of Life. Yeah, there's an Edge article in the Slack on that. So that's, Brian Eno, he's a futurist, I guess, so that makes sense. Brian Eno was a musician. People don't know that. So, and then SimCity kind of, I guess, imploded maybe 10 years ago. They did a SimCity 5 where they had it on servers in the cloud, and the cloud kept crashing, and they couldn't get the thing to update, and so SimCity kind of ran its course. Then there were some other versions of urban simulations that came after that, newer versions of things, and they did things differently than SimCity. So what we're going to do in this feature is we're going to talk about SimCity, some of the things that are connected to that, and then some of the data that you would use to train that kind of a model. So, we're interested in machine learning training in reinforcement learning models where you have data that you can put in to the mix. In this case, what we have is we have a bona fide simulation where we set the initial condition, we run like a grid, it has like parameters that we specify, we give it data that sort of tell it how it should run. So it's kind of like an agent-based model, but we also maybe have stochastic processes that run like a random number generator, that run like different processes that could vary in the real world. And so we run these simulations over long periods of time. And again, like, in like machine learning simulations, we're trying to optimize things, we're trying to minimize the loss. But in these kind of simulations, they run kind of open-ended. So you run them and they kind of do their thing. Sometimes they, your city crashes and burns and you end up with a city that doesn't do anything. Everyone moves out, it gets destroyed, whatever. But a lot of times it just kind of develops its own dynamics over time. So the system changes and you have to respond to it if you can respond to it. And there isn't any imperative for optimization. It's just every time, you have a set of initial conditions, it continues, it persists, hopefully, and you just have to respond to it. and it goes into new phases. So it's a very complex system. So that's my very long-winded preface to this. So this is the first thing I wanted to talk about. So I mentioned that SimCity is on this grid. And so, you'll have this area, it looks like a field with grass, but it's actually a grid underneath. And so each of these, there's a grid with different squares, and each square is a different value. So you start out with nothing, and you might put like a road through it. And then you put a road through it, and you might zone some areas, different types of things, like housing or industrial. And then those things will kind of pop up in the grid. But the interesting thing about this underlying grid is that one cell affects the other cell. So if you put something like an industrial zoning here and some residential zoning here, that residential zoning will be impacted by its neighboring grid or neighboring grid cell, and it will impact it maybe positively or negatively. And then the way to link these grid cells is to have these roads. So you put down a road, and then you want people to have, be able to get through the path, get through the city. So you have to kind of figure out how to build an efficient city, at least from the standpoint of getting around logistics, things like that. And so, usually those things are achieved by a lot of urban planning. Here you just have any person who's playing the game, just throw down some roads and see what happens. So it's a very different approach to urban planning because you're kind of just testing hypotheses. You're saying, here's a road, we'll put this down, see if people, utilize it. If it's underutilized, then maybe we made a mistake. We can get rid of that road, build a new road. They're different, you can kind of destroy things and create things on the fly too. So it helps you basically test a bunch of hypotheses about things. So it's a very different approach to this kind of planning, hyper planning. And so it really does stand in contrast to some of the urban planning stuff that happens, but also maybe some of the cybernetic stuff in that, you have these cybernetic systems that are pretty open-ended, and you can end up doing things that are, responding to unexpected events and things like that. So this is, a video. I'm not going to play the video about how SimCity has the shortest route pathfinding, and they use something called the A-star algorithm. So the A-star algorithm is this algorithm that's used to route things across the grid, and basically uses the A-star to evaluate the value of each grid cell or parcel. So you have these grid cells and parcels. You kind of connect them with these roads. You then evaluate, if those things are accessible, how your citizens are getting around the city, and then you can evaluate sort of things like land values or congestion or well-being just by doing these kinds of things. So this just shows an example of traffic patterns using this A-star algorithm, but they use the A-star in SimCity for a lot of other purposes. So it's an interesting approach to this. They basically have this grid. They can put things on the grid. They have this algorithm that sort of gives you this. They don't try to optimize the simulation per se, but they're optimizing the activity in the simulation. And then they're evaluating it. And you can do things about the city. You can improve it, or you can change things based on that evaluation. So this appears to be an extremely simplistic A-star pathfinding system with no weightings for road density or current traffic congestion whatsoever. So you have this A-star algorithm that you use, and then as you build the city, you weight that algorithm based on different conditions. So if there's traffic on these roads, you would weight the pathfinding algorithm by congestion or by desirability or things like that. So it helps evaluate your city, it helps it grow, and it helps the system know kind of what things are happening and keep track of the interactions, and then show you the results of that, if those interactions are positive or negative. So it's a very interesting way to do this. And the implementation, like I said, this was done in the 1980s. So it's not like they used a lot of computational power to run these simulations. They're, pretty pretty easy to run, I guess, relatively speaking, compared to what, considering what you're trying to do. But they use these very simple tools. So there's the A-star algorithm, which is the first thing. And this is a GitHub repository talking about A-star on grids. So this is, they have software for this where they implement the A-star algorithm. They do this on these grids. This is just like in SimCity, where you have this underlying grid, you're building roads, you're connecting different cells, and you're evaluating those paths between cells, and you're acting upon, whether that's positive or negative to your simulation. And so this is the A-star. Basically, there are different things like move costs. You're using different heuristics and distance metrics. So there are different distance metrics if you're familiar with Manhattan distances or other types of distances that allow you to calculate the cost of moving across the grid. Connection by connection, that allows you to evaluate some of these moves and some of the cost of some of these moves through the city. And depending on the structure of your city, how efficient are things, how positively implemented are things, how negatively implemented are things, and you can fix them accordingly, or at least you can target ways to improve them. So that, there are heuristics to this algorithm. They talk about some algorithmic details here, and then some implementations. So, there are ways to implement the A-star algorithm and do this in a way that's not computationally prohibitive. So this talks a little bit about A-star and implementing this on a grid. This is this GitHub repository. Doesn't really, I don't think it's affiliated with any sort of project. So the next thing I want to talk about is this link to the STEAM community. And they have this article, it's called Practical Engineering, the Optimal Square Grid. And so they're talking here about like building an optimal square grid. This is, I guess this is for cities' skylines. So this is not SimCity, but this is a sort of a thing that came after SimCity called City Skylines. And so this is a newer version of city simulations where they're doing things a little bit differently in the underlying computation, but they're still kind of simulating a city. And so one of the things they're doing are building these grids. And so they're kind of considering what the optimal size for a grid would be. I have assumed that a 10 by 10 grid was best, but it turns out it's not. And so, they figure they have this, you have this thing, you go into the simulation when you kind of construct it in your head. That's like the best way to do things. There are these best practices, and it's the only thing you have, because you can only know if something is really good after you've tested it. So you have these, it's kind of like in science where you have an idea and you might build a hypothesis, and then the simulation environment is for testing the hypothesis. So it's like, okay, what is the best way to build this block or this grid? And so you say, okay, well, maybe it needs to be a certain size. And so you test different sizes and you see what the outcome is. So this is an interesting process of sort of evaluating these things. So I'm not going to get into the details of how City Skylines works, but basically they create this graph that shows for the 10 by 10 grid, the calculation is simple. We get 8 squared zonable tiles and 10 squared tile area for a density of exactly 64%. So, this is an exercise in figuring out how to build a grid that allows you to have maximal zonable tiles in a certain area. So that's what they're trying to optimize here. So this is a graph here where they have these different grid sizes square. So as you can see, as you go up to 12, you get up to 60, maybe 65, and then it goes down from there. So you can actually figure out the optimal components to build these kind of simulations. I think it's really interesting stuff. And so you can go back and you can do some math on this to figure out the optimal type of thing. So you're not trying to optimize the simulation here. You're just trying to optimize the components This holds true for the A-star algorithm and for some of these components like tiles and other components that you need to build. So I really find this fascinating because, in building simulations or even going back to machine learning, we think about how we optimize models. And this is a very different way of doing this, but people have been doing this for many years. So it might be worth revisiting it. Now we move on to this, let's see. Okay, so now we move on to this idea of using spreadsheets and using data to build simulations. And so, now we've kind of got our model. We have our initial conditions. We can initialize our model with different features. We can run it and, we can see what happens. But how do we know how to get even where to start with that? Because it's just like, when we build like a road or build a city, we don't know what the reasonable parameters are. So, one of the things we can do is collect data from the real world. We can put in, plug in values, a range of values, and see how they behave in this environment. And so this also leads us maybe to use this as a tool for urban planning, where we can say, I have this good idea. Let's see if it works in the real world, and we can simulate it. And if we calibrate it with good data, we can get a good result. So this is Samuel Arbesman's Substack called Cabinet of Wonders. He's got some wonderful things on here from time to time, but this is an article that he put out recently called "The Spreadsheet is a Simulation Machine." And this is basically talking about the idea of a spreadsheet and how you build these spreadsheets. There's a history of spreadsheet building in computing, and people kind of maybe think that spreadsheets are passé, but people have traditionally used them as ways to sort of construct models. And so this is really interesting. This is VisiCalc. This is an ad from, I don't know if they still have VisiCalc, but it was an early spreadsheet. This was before Excel, because Excel came later, where they would build these tables, basically. And, you'd have like different labels to the columns, and the rows would have cases. So it's very data science oriented. And so, but, before spreadsheets, or when spreadsheets are being developed, they had to develop data structures for this. So it's like, how do you build a data structure that encapsulates the rows and the columns and the cases, but also in a way that I can manipulate in real time? So, in a spreadsheet, you would have like a bunch of numbers, but you also might have an equation that transforms those numbers somehow. So I could take like the cost and the profit, and I could do some transformation of that and get a number. And that number then could help me build a new variable that I could then use in an analysis or feed it into a simulation. So this is interesting that we have this tool, and people will develop spreadsheets for accounting and things like that, and it's important for that. But you can also do simulations in spreadsheets. And so this article is on how you're really simulating the world using a spreadsheet. You can build like variables, and collect the data, or you can generate a set of numbers that are hypothetical. You can put random numbers in as a row. You can put in, or a column. You can put in, different values for something like from 10 to 100, like we saw in the last example in this graph here, where they sort of had an optimization plot here where they're trying to figure out the maximum. So these are all things that are, possible with a spreadsheet. So spreadsheets are actually quite useful tools in and of themselves. And he's talking here about building simulations with them, or using spreadsheets as a simulation machine. So this article starts in 1984, a fusion to the spreadsheet revolution. The tech journalist Stephen Levy wrote a long and fascinating article about this genre of software. Not only is the article a time capsule of computing history, it also gives one a sense for how people were thinking about spreadsheets even then. So this article is from Wired, a spreadsheet way of knowledge from 2014. Actually, it was posted in 2014. It's from 1984. And a quote from this article is, all this powerful scenario testing machinery right there on the desktop, induces some people to experiment with elaborate models. They talk of playing with the numbers, massaging the model. Computer hackers lose themselves in the intricacies of programming. Spreadsheet hackers lose themselves in the world of what if. So you can, like your big city simulation, you can use a spreadsheet to sort of ask these questions about what if, test hypotheses, do these sorts of things. So it's, like SimCity is basically, and I'm going to get to this, is a big spreadsheet, essentially. You have this grid, you have the A-star algorithm, you have these other visualization features in the graphical user interface, but at its heart, it's really a spreadsheet. And what you're doing is basically doing operations on sort of a spatial spreadsheet, where you have like the spatial orientation of a grid, but also that you're sort of plugging in numbers over time. So you have this grid that's, X in an XY coordinate system. You're, keeping track of what your neighboring variables are doing, and then you're simulating this over time. So you're saying, if I change this value, what's the next value? So you can build some really interesting sort of dynamical systems out of these kind of scenarios. But at its heart, it's a spreadsheet, and you can implement SimCity as a minimal sort of simulation on a spreadsheet, theoretically. So this is really interesting that thinking about it in this way. And so, spreadsheets allow each of us to build little worlds and play with them, seeing how small changes might make a big difference, or even how big differences might make none whatsoever. Because functions can be embedded within spreadsheet cells, the large digital grid essentially becomes a small, constantly updating computer, the embedded text elaborating an entire virtual cosmos, working with both the functions and data within each cell. And so during the height of the COVID pandemic, I spent an inordinate amount of time playing with a spreadsheet developed by scientists at the University of Colorado, and this is the COVID estimator, that focused on the aerosol spread of virus particles by entering room dimensions, so you can model the size of the room, the number of people in the room, assumptions about behavior, mask usage, and more. I was able to better understand the shape and bounds of so many pronouncements that were swirling around. So basically, you can model this space. You have enough parameters, you have enough real world data, you can come up with really good hypotheses about some system's behavior. And so, again, it's not a city, but it's, it's the philosophy of the thing. And so, once spreadsheets were invented, they kind of spread everywhere, and there's a reason why they spread everywhere. And it's because they have this kind of useful aspect to them. So yes, and then, of course, and one of their key powers is that a mechanism for thinking about the future. According to computer scientist Alan Kay, and this is an article from Computer Software from Scientific American, the creators of VisiCalc, the first spreadsheet, were actually surprised that users were not just analyzing the past, but trying to predict the future. So this is where, you're trying to use your spreadsheet to predict the future using, like these transformations, putting an equation in place and asking these what if questions, and it allows you to predict the future and predict dynamics. And so dynamic spreadsheets were invented by Daniel Bricklin and Robert Frankston as a reaction to the frustration Bricklin felt when he had to work with the old ruled paper versions in business school. So they used to have these pieces of paper that were like, ruled paper or grid paper, where they would have to do things, they would visualize things by hand. And so you could do these kind of visualizations, but they weren't, in a computer. So it was kind of hard to do these simulations over time and change the variables in real time. They were surprised by the success of the idea and by the fact that most people who bought the first spreadsheet program, VisiCalc, exploited it to forecast the future rather than to account for the past. So instead of using it as sort of an accounting tool, people were doing these kind of forecasting activities. So it's really interesting how that is sort of in the nature of people using spreadsheets. But seeking to develop a smart editor, they had created a simulation tool. So that's a really interesting point about simulation and very simple tools that we can implement, and then building these large simulations. Now, a couple final points about this. If you want to look at what, say, SimCity's inputs were, this is an example here where you have basically these tables that you can collect from real world data, or you can build like a table that's maybe of plausible data. But the point is that you need to have these, you need to account for the kinds of things that you would have in the real world. So, for example, if you wanted to build the structure of like energy and education in a certain region, you would put in all of these variables, and you would, kind of give them values. You would have a range of values over a range of conditions, and then you could actually extrapolate from that. So you could build like a starting cost where you have different values for wind or solar or nuclear, and then you could build these functions that would allow you to interpolate values for different conditions. So you can do all sorts of things with input data, and you can do this in machine learning. But the thing is that you're not trying to train the model to predict. You're actually doing the prediction by query or by hand, even, or the simulation just sweeps the parameter and just kind of samples values. So, it's a little bit different approach to it. This is the second example of, data. So this is where you have not like continuous data, but you just have sort of discrete data where you have different raw materials, building supplies. This is very gamified in where you have like these inventories of things, materials, building supplies, different things like that. So this is another example of the type of data we might use in a kind of a simulation like this. So, again, it's really built on data. It's about predicting from data. You can build all of this in a spreadsheet, at least initially, and then transform it to one of these more complicated simulations, and then build these really, complex dynamical systems from that. All right, so it looks like we've got some things in the chat here. Yeah, so let's start up here. So yeah, we talked about Morgan's mom being an urban planner. We talked about Brian Eno. And Himanshu says that A-star agents are used in a lot of evaluating playability in game environment settings. Yeah, A-star is used quite a bit. It's a pretty classic algorithm. It can be implemented in a number of ways. And I should mention that A-star isn't your only option. It's a popular algorithm because it's pretty versatile, but you can use other types of optimization algorithms or things that are like A-star in different ways. So he posted something from ResearchGate, which is this Mario AI competition article. This is 2009 Mario AI competition. This is from IEEE Explore. This is where they did this Mario AI competition. The focus was on developing controllers that could play a version of Super Mario Brothers as well as possible. So you're trying to build like an artificial agent that plays Super Mario really well. So it's kind of like the way that we do like with chess and Go, but with Super Mario, and building these kind of ways to control the play, which is interesting. So thank you for that, Himanshu. Jesse said the fate of many companies is still in make a spreadsheet so we can see those numbers mode. Yeah, it's definitely there's an accounting imperative for like spreadsheets and especially in organizations, but the simulation aspect is important too. And yeah, it does get lost. It's like the forest through the trees, right? And so that's yeah, it's important. Spreadsheet City probably wasn't as fun to market. Yeah, there's no visualization aspect, and yeah, that would be fun. Spreadsheet City. That's what we should do. Make that. Then
I was gonna say I disagree. Eve Online is a very popular game.
this is what is Eve Online?
Well, sometimes it's called spreadsheets about space.
Oh, okay.
Like you're running yeah, empires of spaceships, and
Oh yeah.
they've got their own money, and they have massive wars, and yeah, it's really interesting. I've got some crowdsourced books on the history of Eve Online, but anyway.
Oh wow.
It basically run as a spreadsheet.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I think like there are games that run as a spread. It's kind of like Zork, where it's a text-based game. Do things like that. So yeah, if you're not captivated by graphics, but you're really interested in the mechanics, that's for you, I guess. So yeah, Himanshu says, could you share the link of this article? Very interesting. Yeah, I have the links. I'll put them up on I usually put them in the YouTube stub. So if you go to the YouTube video for the meeting, they're in the stub. I'll probably share it in the general channel as well with the video. Then Sarrah says, this article reminds me of a project I've seen in Octave from this group here. Octave, which is an open source equivalent of MATLAB, is used heavily for mathematical and scientific computations. This project was an attempt to connect it to LibreOffice Calc, which is an open source spreadsheet, and then bring this together with tabular formatting data with visualization capabilities. Yeah, it's a good way to interface. Usually we interface things with the tab delimited format CSV. That's just a way to bring data into your system, though. To interact with it and to transform it in different ways, you need to have different tools for that. So it's interesting that spreadsheets are fundamentally different from CSVs. CSVs are like bringing something into a environment in a very efficient way, so you don't have to worry about the formatting. You can bring it in as cases and variables. But then, of course, the spreadsheet allows you to do interactive things with it. So it's kind of an interesting approach there. And then Himanshu said Robin Baumgarten's A-star agent had won the Mario AI competition and is used a lot in 2D game settings. Yeah. I wasn't familiar with the Mario AI competition, so that's an interesting find. I don't know if you want to talk about it more or not, but so that's all I have on that. I hope you found that interesting. I've been kind of collecting those things. I wanted to go through it.
But VisiCalc is famous, or I haven't seen that in a long time.
Yeah,
it's like every so often, if you follow Dave Weiner, who developed RSS. There's a number of other things, but kind of known for RSS and podcasting. He'll talk about the lessons learned from VisiCalc, from time to time, because he's such an old school Silicon Valley guy.
Yeah.
It's SimCity stuff's always funny to me because I kind of grew up with my mom talking about like ArcGIS modeling and traffic simulations, and how governments ignore good simulation work that shows if you build more roads, that just makes more cars.
Right.
Yeah. As well as the SimCity, the winning strategy seemed to be somewhat totalitarian.
Right.
Like why was that?
Yeah.
Yeah. The trouble of getting dominating with a democratic government was very difficult.
Yeah. This is it's an interesting point. There are some critiques of SimCity that it's not realistic in that way. That they kind of tilt it so that you can win it, but it's hard to do so where it's not, you're not ruling with an iron fist, I guess. So it's, I don't know.
but it's one of those things like again, when you get these computational agents to play video games,
right.
And then you find that they develop a strategy that's a winning strategy, but you're like, but hey, wait, that's cheating, or but that's not the way to play it or something. But by the actual rules, that is the winning strategy, or that is the superhuman strategy, right? And anyway, it does make me think again of the AI economist as the closest thing I've seen to a good simulation of actual public policy,
right?
Or the way you would want it.
Yeah, you mentioned superhuman strategy, so that was something we've been talking about in the context of AI. And it's interesting that, our language is kind of like, this is the strategy for planning. But so what's happening is the simulation is running underneath, right? Like everything is sort of running underneath, and it's not controlled by any one person unless you're talking about how people regulate it. And so, when we interact with something like a very complex system, it's kind of like interacting with a biological system if we're building maybe an implant or even a medical intervention where we have this system that is going and has its own dynamics that we kind of understand, but we can control, but it's hard to control without having some unintended consequence somewhere else. So we're just kind of trying to figure out how to intervene without destroying the system, and doing our best there. And it's kind of an interesting parallel because it's like, can we build a system that really regulates a very complex system like that without, maybe the reason why only the iron fist strategies work is because it's basically that you have to do that to control all the variation that's happening. And, it's probably not tenable either, which is the other problem.
But again, I feel like it's more for the programmers that it is easier to have this kind of centralized control master loop, right? Than to know how to generate control from collective action, or generate a kind of complex homeostasis. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm trying to find the right word that's not control, because control already kind of gives the game away, right? The Active Inference Institute talk yesterday was on an extension. They did an active inference drone control software.
Okay.
So trying to make a drone more autonomous in that it's setting its own destinations kind of thing.
Yeah. And
then this week's talk on this from the same group was basically about the interface for agent communication. So how to get them now, not only to be autonomous, but to also interact with other autonomous agents. And I'm curious what the flocking behavior looks like.
Oh yeah.
for instance.
Yeah.
But just some interesting questions about how does agent communication differ from agent environment understanding, and if it should differ at all.
Yeah. So that's great. Did we have any other questions about any of that? Any other comments? All right. If not, then I don't know. Morgan wanted to give an update. He said he might do so later.
Yeah. So we started the how to grow almost anything synthetic bio course here, which has been interesting. I think we could benefit from a longer benchling focus So I've dropped a link in the. I'm looking for good. Yeah. I don't know what to call it. It's not. I'm not looking for genomic tools, but like for these kind of genomic manipulation. So again, like for those who know benchling, like what are tools that are like benchling that we have more control over, aren't just a web interface. And you know, this is yeah, kind of the basic things for designing yeah, designing plasmids, designing, you know, designing experiments with them. And so I dropped a link to the UCLA bioinformatics, I forget what they call it, but co-laboratory, I think. Anyway, that has like so far the nicest breakdown I've seen of kind of yeah, mini courses and kind of which courses depend on which other courses. So as you know get more experienced and get to more advanced kind of Unixy tools. Let's see what else we've done. I know we've done some more things. Well, just interesting meetings on TFUS. So probably be talking about transcranial focused ultrasound as a neuromodulatory device. So these are kind of things that have traditionally been done with electricity, using electrical stimulation or magnetic TMS, and this is yeah. I've again I drop a lot of these links in the NeuroTechX Slack, and which I do recommend if you are interested in this kind of neurotech, because there's yeah, there's interesting workshops that are at least online if you're interested to see people present on this. But yeah, we'll be doing some events here in San Francisco on that are neurotech related, and yeah, Jess might be interested in this RDoc paper that I dropped into computational psychiatry for kind of DSM or post DSM. Two interesting papers. One about the connection between, you know, historic connections between neurology and psychiatry. Well, I should say historic splits between between the two, but how they should perhaps benefit from new thinking in both fields. And I'll look around for some other papers, but
yeah, that's great. Thank you, Morgan. Yeah, that's always good stuff. You share that paper, actually. It looks kind of interesting. So this is the paper he's referring to, this Bridging the Great Divide. What can neurology learn from psychiatry? So this is, you know, it's kind of going over the historical origins of both fields and then kind of how they rely on similar tools to study brain disorders. So, you know, one of the things we're trying to do, I guess, in computational psychiatry is figure out how to use computational tools for sort of psychiatry, how to improve psychiatry with different computational tools, but also some of the physiological tools that, you know, are up and coming. So that's if you go to the channel, that's, you know, it's kind of the theme of the channel. So this kind of goes over this history. Neurology and psychiatry are kind of sharing these tools, sharing common historical origins, yet the practical integration of medical and scientific approaches across these clinical neurosciences have remained elusive. And so, while much has been written about the need to incorporate emerging systems level, cellular, molecular, and genetic epigenetic advances into a science of mind for psychiatric disorders, less attention has been given to applying clinical neuroscience principles to conceptualize neurologic conditions using an integrated neurobio-psychosocial approach. This is like where they start getting into these hyphenated terms, basically situating this in a couple of different fields simultaneously. So you have the neurobiology, you have the psychology or the psycho aspect, and then the social aspect. In this perspective article, we briefly outline the historically interwoven and complicated relationship between neurology and psychiatry, and then how some traditional psychiatric conditions are being reconceptualized as part of disorders of neurodevelopment and awareness. So, this is where you're taking what we've known from psychiatry and reconceptualizing it in this neurobiosocial, psychosocial approach. And then this divide between neurology and psychiatry can be narrowed by moving from lesion-based towards circuit-based understandings of neuropsychiatric disorders, from unidirectional towards bidirectional models of brain behavior. So usually, in psychiatry, it's like the brain creates the behavior, and in fact, it's this interrelationship. It's kind of like brain environment or behavior environment type of relationship where there are interactions. And then going from categorical diagnoses towards sort of transdiagnostic dimensional perspectives, and from silo-based research toward interdisciplinary approaches. So it's a good paper, I think, probably for our computational psychiatry endeavor, but also, of course, Jesse and Jen Jiang are working on the DSM stuff. So that might be interesting there as well. Okay. Let me go to the chat. So Sarrah put this arXiv paper in the chat, and she says this discusses agent, and agent environment communication to quite a good degree. So this is this paper on multi-agent collaboration, harnessing the power of intelligent large language model agents. And so this kind of goes into some of these, talks about auto GPT and baby AGI models. So that's interesting. We've talked about, of course, developmental AGI. I didn't know there was a baby AGI category, but this is interesting stuff. So that's an interesting reading. Paola said, "Hello everyone, a bit late and tired here, but I cannot find the Neurotech channel on Slack. May have to be invited to that." So it's usually this channel here, virtual reality neurotech. Okay, yeah, you joined it. So good.
I think she was. I was referring to the Neurotech X Slack.
Oh yeah.
And so if you go to neurotechx.com and you sign up, it's free. It's just collecting your info and sending you a Slack invite.
Yeah. And then Slack collects your data as well.
And now Slack is Slack is trading on my 10 years of NeuroTechX comments.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Okay. So yeah, the Slack issues notwithstanding, it's in the NeuroTechX Slack. But yeah, that's great. Yeah, thanks. So that'd be an interesting thing to look at. Some of these different tools and techniques. We haven't looked at the computational psychiatry channel for a while. We might do that actually. I don't know how much is accumulated there, but we think we got the exercise training. I think that's something we covered in, I think, 2 weeks ago. There's some interesting videos in here. Anything you'd like to highlight, Morgan?
I mean, Slack has also gotten very slow.
Yeah.
I dropped in this link about chatbots that again I put in things like that. You're passing things that now I'm like, oh yeah, these are great. Sorry, like we should all stop what we're doing.
It's very tempting, yes. It's very tempting.
Paul Thompson has to say. but perhaps more general, just about chatbots again. In psychiatry and I think maybe it's also because I'm here in San Francisco where everybody's trying to monetize psychiatry. Chatbots are the people think of it as the low-hanging fruit now because LLMs have sucked all the oxygen out of AI, right?
Yeah.
And again, I just think it's good to just understand how completely novel these are, and how like we don't understand therapist patient dynamics well.
Yeah.
so to start throwing people at chatbots would be way too early. And again, like I appreciate what Hussain had to say about what we what we would want, like where we want these things to go. But it's really important to understand like how they end up getting used, and
Right.
and what again like more field research essentially where we're not controlling, and just seeing like what are the kind of natural dynamics that people fall into with chatbots. As it is, probably again, I haven't done enough of this, but I think it would be related. Just what are the dynamics that people get into with all the algorithms, in the sense of, people talk about, being radicalized by YouTube, being radicalized by TikTok, being radicalized by, Facebook.
Right.
And yeah, so this is, sometimes I put these things in is because they resonate as a, this highlights an issue that we should think about more.
Right.
And it's one of those things that's like, I find the conversations around it to sometimes be a lot like the conversations around microdosing, which is another kind of popular psychiatric trend.
Yeah.
Where it's just like just too much anecdotal evidence, too much and too much initial studies focus too much on metrics on which they are biased to do well on, or it's kind of normal at first for people to focus on things where they're kind of expecting effect, as opposed to collecting a wide range of data and then seeing learning more, right? And especially learning about what they didn't expect. And I think this is why we see, again, I'm also trying to understand the common problem in psychiatry where we have treatments and novel approaches that do have a kind of initial period where it seems promising, and studies are positive and they pass 0.05 significance, and then 5 years later they're not, and meta analyses are showing so it's like, is it just numbers, is it the metrics that we're using, again, how to explain these things, and as well as like we still seem to be going for we seem to be going for interventions that are doing better than placebo, right?
Yeah.
which is already putting us in some quite high statistical noise.
Yeah. Yeah, there's the aspect of using data, like using more than anecdotal evidence, and then there's the issue of, effect size. So what is the effect size of something?
And again, I see UK Biobank just hitting one like major announcement after another in terms of absolutely new science, right? It's because they've got 40,000, because they're doing this just massive data collection, and where they're able to see physiology of people before they're sick, right?
Okay.
So big announcement that I think it was this week, something like 160 proteins that changed in 10% of people who have been a part of this massive data collection, and then they developed cancer years after. So I think it was maybe like a huge number like 7 years before, and then a smaller number like 3 years before. That that is, I think, is part of why I'm seeing this big push on kind of liquid biopsies and blood tests, in the kind of startup medical, med tech, and I yeah, just that, like we need more of that. Oh, sorry, one update. I had a good meeting with MedArc, which is a community. It's a community group that's focused on kind of foundation models for medicine, or med tech. And the MedArc seems to be getting a lot of support from Stability AI, which is the company behind Stable Diffusion, right? Or they got a lot of this current buzz going. And the head, they have a head of neuroimaging and AI, Paul Scotti, who's part of a lot of these Discord groups. Now, the particular one that I joined was focused on brain-inspired transformer models. So they're really kind of trying to do a neuro AI. But it was interesting that the person leading that meeting was at the Child Mind Institute, and so at first I was like, you're at the Child Mind Institute, love the Healthy Brain Network data set, right? So where they're doing this biobank, like UK Biobank like study of collecting 10,000 data from 10,000 kids. So it's sort of like ABCD as well, which is a big NIMH study. And just but even better is the longitudinal aspect of it, right? So like how many of those 5-year-olds in the child, how many of those, say, 5 to 10-year-olds in the Child Mind Institute data set are going to develop a major mental health diagnosis in at 12 to 15, something like that, right? And how much we could get if we actually had blood and other say proteomics, again, like really getting at physiology and molecular biology of those kids pre-diagnosis, and how little of that is going on in psychiatry, which is which is not to say that this explains everything that we're discussing, but at the same time, like you see with that with the computational with the paper on exercise,
Like,
right,
you know, there is a lot more going on and we can track all these things, you know. And so I think, you know, just to come full circle to that history of neurology and psychiatry, you know, there, you know, there was an unfortunate shift away in the you know, kind of like 20s to the 50s, 60s, away from a wholly physiological, you know, molecular approach to psychiatry. That you know, as the book I always push, the mind fixers history of psychiatry shows that, like, you know, that I think we're still dealing with that legacy.
Yeah.
And you know, the more we take a you know, an oncology like approach, I think the better. And yeah, then the group that I see doing the most of that, I mean, the longevity groups I think are interesting because of this aging problem that you have with patients, psychiatry patients, dying so young. But Indiana's the head of psychiatry has a very, you know, blood biomarker based approach to psychiatry that again is really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. It's you know, we saw from those, or from a lot of the big data, I guess you could call big data approaches or multi-measure approaches, is that there's a lot. First of all, there's a lot to put together. So it's like understanding, like, and usually the way we do this, of course, is dimensionality reduction. We're kind of comparing different metrics. So, you know, for each metric, if you have like metabolomics, proteomics, those are going to have different signatures. And then putting those together, figuring out how those go together and contribute to some sort of prediction down the line. So, you know, you have that approach, and then you have the dimensionality reduction approach, which is that things are going to share some variance. And we can reduce it down to those things that share enough variance that are predictive. And of course, those work, but there are probably other ways to do this as well. And it's really, you know, I don't know what the answer would be there, but there's just, you know, again, it's a matter of, like, you know, our understanding of things and how much we can sort of abstract away from the data and build a model of it and, you know, use that as a tool.
Yeah, you know, Emily, I think it's Emily Bender. Is it the linguist? Yeah. And her awesomely named podcast, like Mystery AI Hype Theater 3000, I think. It's something like that. Anyway.
Yeah.
She, I forget the guest that was on, but they were talking about these automated lab platforms. Mm-hmm. And, you know, and I understand what they were saying in terms of, oh, you know, like, this is just what we don't need, you know, like machines generating papers that aren't even readable by humans. You know, certainly there's plenty to talk about in terms of, you know, the massive GPT written papers that are, I'm sure, flooding editors' boxes. But at the same time, when you look at something like, you know, that kind of molecular biology of exercise, you know, like there's also a lot of stuff where it's like humans don't need to necessarily be involved in tracking the 3,000 metabolites. And, you know, you see what I mean? Like,
yeah, I know what you mean.
Like I would hope and I would expect that there's actually a middle ground there, where there are things that we can that we can change about how science is done, and yet, you know, we can also insist on the science being, you know, human. You know, having human oversight and human interpretability,
right,
and human understanding, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, and it's always that middle way that's the hardest.
Yeah. So it's like, again, with a lot of these high throughput methods, we're kind of like getting these massive samples, we're analyzing them, and of course, in a sort of like, if you think about molecular biology, the way analysis works is that you're putting in some things and you're doing some reactions and you're getting some output, and an output then has to be normalized and like, debiased, so you have all these technical things that you have to do to the measure, and then you have a measure, and you say, what does this mean? And so then, it's like, okay, well, I can compare it with maybe, sometimes we do comparisons, like we'll do like a wild type versus a mutant, or we'll do like a resting state versus a active state. We just try to create these conditions where we may have some idealized condition and then whatever condition it is we're interested in. And so again, it's like this intersection of like how we can devise a way to make these comparisons and how we generate the data and how we map, like, what is it, basically a technical output to something that we can say, this is a good measure of the thing that we're trying to get a handle on. Because the measure itself is like arbitrary, even though it's in numbers. It's like we're creating this technical tool that gives us this stuff, this output. How does that relate to some condition? Can we create a measure, or can we create a tool that allows you to have measures that have discrete states that map to some disorder? And that's really and there's a lot of work that goes into like perfecting tools like that too. Like, with PCR, for example, people optimize PCR so that you can get good, technical outputs that are repeatable, right? So people work on it. They don't just throw things in a reaction and then just hope for the best. But that's the kind of thing we're dealing with. So it's not just a matter of like, having an interpretable method for kind of, doing an analysis. It's also kind of getting the data and getting the measure of something. And so, we've worked, there are all these things that we've developed in science, like standardized units, which are like, if you have a standardized unit of something, the reason we do that is because we want to be able to say from any one person to any other person taking a measurement, say of temperature, that you can compare the two things. So like if I say it's 68 degrees Fahrenheit, you say it's 68 degrees Fahrenheit, we know there's some reliability in that observation. Otherwise, it's kind of like we don't have any way to validate the observations. If I say it's 68 degrees and you say it's 68 degrees, just by like, going outside and making an estimate, there are a lot of things that go into that estimate that are unreliable. And so it's definitely, so we have the tools, we have the techniques of like normalization, and then we have the visualization techniques or the analytical techniques that are important. So yeah, I think there's a lot there. There's a lot there of interest. So looks like we lost a bunch of people, and I know it's late in a lot of places. So
It is,
yeah. But yeah, I mean, going back to the computational psychiatry channel,
Yep.
If people want to check that out, there's a lot there. This is actually something Hussain posted on. Shout out to the developer of Roblox. This is they're using, okay, so this is where they're using they're developing something called Neuroblox, a software platform developed that will model brain circuits to treat brain disorders. I'm interested in this, Neuroblox.
Yeah.
So this is actually where they're taking inspiration from Roblox. They're doing modeling so Roblox, of course, if people aren't aware, it's this virtual world where you build things with blocks and you can like stack them or build structures. And then, this is something you can implement on a headset or on a smartphone or whatever. Right now, there's a disconnect between the aims of clinical research and the computational tools we have to exploit that. So there's people are doing a lot of stuff with Roblox, which you know it basically allows you to sort of visualize some of the stuff, so you can put things into a world where you can get insights. And again, underlying those models are a lot of numbers, a lot of input data, but we have to have some way to interpret it. It's interesting. Yeah, and then of course we did the exercise paper. We did this chatbots.
There's a good one there on genetic atlas of embryo, of the human embryo, human brain. Yeah,
this
just
one
that
here.
New genetic atlas. Yeah.
Okay.
But this is very specific.
Well, this is another one.
But again, there's just all this new data that's coming together. And I kind of going back to last week's conversation with Paola, these great databases that have all this new, all these new results. But it would be great to link them to, the database that came out 6 months ago that had, the weeks before that, right?
Yeah.
that's being, put together by a different consortium of multi-site universities, right?
Yeah.
And and I wanted to just also, just checking my LinkedIn there, that Neuromatch has some new announcements, calling for mentors, but also research collaborations.
Oh, I hadn't seen that part.
They sorry, I'm just my internet seems very slow, but I'll pull it up here. What did they say? Research partnerships. Yeah, exciting. Introducing our research partnerships program. If you are a researcher looking for help with software, machine learning pipelines, or scaling your research to cloud services, we can connect you with a suitable partner.
Yeah.
So neuromatch.io/partner.
Okay.
And I think also some other, some other things that they've been doing in terms of, trying to. I mean, I think it's maybe /mentor, but again, trying to connect students together with people that give them a early career advice and things like that.
Yeah, I will once again be mentoring through NeuroMatch, and they will have the Neuro AI courses here. So they have the deep learning course, the computational neuroscience, and now the Neuro AI. Actually, I think they may have changed the deep learning course from the Neuro AI course. I'm not too sure, but we'll probably go through the Neuro AI course this year. So what we did in years past is we would go through they have the curriculum sort of as an open curriculum, and the idea would be to try to go through each week's curriculum, and then just kind of like hit the highlights of that curriculum, for the group, so we can talk about it. Jesse has perpetually been talking about doing this slow pod, which is where you take the materials and you break it out into like multiple weeks and kind of go through it very slowly, so you can get a sense of, because they go through it very fast and they kind of dump it on you. This would be like a very slow kind of working through the curriculum. So that those are very interesting approaches to sort of open education. So we'll be doing more about that this summer. Okay, Paola has some things on the chat here. Thanks, Morgan. I'm looking at the page on NeuroMatch. Let's see if it leads anywhere interesting. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So let's see. Let me go back to sharing my screen. Let's see. Okay, so I did want to talk about this set of papers here. So this is a topic of sort of modeling cultural evolution using large language models. So we've talked about large language models as sort of this way to implement, or to connect it with reinforcement learning and large language models for therapeutic means in psychiatry. This is a paper on cultural evolution in populations of large language models. So we have, of course, biological evolution, we have cultural evolution, and cultural evolution is basically where you have cultural practices or cultural norms, and you can see evolution in that. And in language, it's really nice to see cultural evolution because you'll see like different terms change over time, and different grammars change over time. So this is where they're going with this. They can model cultural evolution in a system that has some relevance to like what we see in humans, which is kind of the point of this. So this is Pierre-Yves Odier, who's at the Flowers team at INRIA, which we talked about their stuff last week with respect to modeling gene regulatory networks and their competencies. So we talked about that work last week. They had a nice set of demos, open source demos, a nice set of work that they're doing on that. But they're also doing this work on cultural evolution and large language models. So let's go over the abstract and then maybe get into some of the paper, and then I have some other things alongside of that. So research in cultural evolution aims at providing causal explanations for the change of culture over time. So basically in cultural evolution, we're interested in building things like phylogenies, or building like things like what they call seriation of cultural artifacts over time. So like in archaeology, they'll often build they'll take artifacts from a site and they'll order it by its temporal order. So they'll start at the most ancient thing and they'll go to the most recent thing, and they try to figure out what those are, what those changes, what the order of those changes are. You can also use in linguistics, especially, a phylogeny, which assumes that you have these sort of common ancestral forms that branch off and produce variants over time. So they're interested in this causal aspect of this. Over the past decades, this field has generated an important body of knowledge using experimental, historical, and computational methods. While computational models have been very successful at generating testable hypotheses about the effects of several factors, such as population structure or transmission biases. So, cultural evolution happens in populations. You have, a bunch of people, they're interacting, they have this culture. Cultures can fission, they can break apart into two or more cultures over time, and but you need to have this population aspect of it. And then transmission biases are when cultural practices are transmitted from, say, like a tutor to a student or from a parent to a child. They may give every piece of information, or they may only give certain information. Or some cultural practices are preferred over others, so that they're transmitted in a biased way. And so you can model all these things, and that's what they're going to do here. So they have hypotheses about these effects. Some phenomena have been so far been more complex to capture using agent-based informal models. So they're trying to use these different types of modeling tools like phylogenies and other types of categorical tools, but also you can use agent-based models because you can have a population of agents that pass things on to their descendants, and then you have some generative data that you can then mine to see what the cultural evolution looks like. This in particular is the case for the effect of transformations of social information induced by evolved cognitive mechanisms. So this is where we're interested in social information and in populations, and we're interested in sort of these cognitive, the intersection between cognition and culture. We here propose that leveraging the capacity of large language models to mimic human behavior may be fruitful to address this gap. So they're going to use large language models. They're going to use the sort of the generative capacity of large language models, and they're going to pass things on to offspring large language models, I guess, to model this sort of process. On top of being a useful approximation of human cultural dynamics, multi-agent models featuring generative agents are also important to study for their own sake. So, we can actually approximate human cultural dynamics using multi-agent models, not always large language models, but this is actually very similar to what Sarrah was talking about in her review, that people are using multi-agent models for these collective behavior things. And cultural dynamics are very much the sort of the embodiment of collective behavior. You have these collective goals that need to be achieved, and you build these practices around that. So you build in this sort of set of practices that enable people to cooperate or enable them to do something through some sort of rituals or some set of like practices. So it really does, it does fit into this multi-agent model framework quite well. So you use a multi-agent model featuring generative agents. Indeed, as artificial agents are bound to participate more and more to the evolution of culture. So these agents are, bound to participate in the evolution of culture. It is crucial to better understand the dynamics of machine-generated cultural evolution. We have presented a framework for simulating cultural evolution in populations of large language models, allowing the manipulation of variables known to be important in cultural evolution. And those are the following. Network structure, so how the agents are interconnected, how they interact. Some agents will interact more than others. If you're, if you think about in culture, if you're in the same research group, or you're in, you're alumni of the same school, or you speak the same language, you're more likely to interact than if not. So there's this network structure aspect. There's the personality aspect, which is where personality sort of primes the way you express those cultural practices. And then the way social information is aggregated and transformed. So again, there are different ways that this happens in different cultures. The software we developed for conducting these simulations is open source and features an intuitive user interface. And they want to build this link between cultural evolution and generative AI. So they want to be able to model cultural evolution with generative AI. They want to be able to use that as a tool. So, they kind of talk about like myths and stories. And that's kind of a lot of people will think of cultural evolution in different ways. There are different ways to think about. It's very hard to define culture in the first place. So there are different definitions of culture, but also that people will focus on different aspects of it. So in this case, they're interested in myths and stories. And this is something, of course, that we can this is something that's tractable using large language models. So it's good. So myths and stories are found in every human culture around the world. Research using phylogenetic methods, which are these trees that we can build from a common ancestry, have revealed that myths evolve in a way analogous to genes. So there's this model that's been persistent in cultural evolution that, culture basically evolves like genes. They've also have models of gene-cultural coevolution, which means that culture can evolve with genetic variation. So there's a rich history here of using phylogenetics in modeling culture in different ways. So in especially in linguistics too, because language, of course, evolves with populations that evolve as, like genetic populations evolve as cultural populations and so forth. So in using this phylogenetic method, it's revealed that myths evolve in a way analogous to genes, progressively changing as some elements are discarded and new elements are added as they're passed through the generations. So, instead of having this model of mutation of DNA or something like that, you have this model of mutating a story or mutating a myth. So, this is where you might train a model on extant stories that exist. And then what happens over time is that if those stories get told, they get passed down, they change, they mutate. And we don't have, like, mutation isn't the same as how it is in uh, say like DNA, where you have base pairs and they change in a certain order. It's just that you might take different elements of a story or of a corpus of language, and you change the elements. So, you can think of, like, if I tell you a story and you tell your friend a story and so on and so forth, that story might significantly mutate across that path of transmission. And so that's what they're doing here. They're looking at those mutational events in the story. Some of these myths display a surprising stability, being retained with minor modifications through generations. So some stories remain remarkably consistent over time, some don't. And so we have to account for that variation as well. And so, maybe that's because they're very important to get right. Maybe it's because they're written down versus being an oral tradition, whatever. The point is that we have this variation, and we should incorporate that into our model, because that seems to be the way cultures work. So, moreover, myths in distinct cultures seem to exhibit shared features, possibly pointing to convergent evolution. And so this is the case in the case of historical myths, which may have been found to possess many similar elements, such as narratives featuring the collective challenges faced in the history of the group. So it gets important to get these kind of stories right. Sometimes it doesn't really matter so much. And so this is a thing that we could model if that's something that we think is important, and they do. More generally, providing causal explanations to change the culture over time is a central aim of research in cultural evolution. So there are two schools of thought here. The first one is the Californian school, which adopts the framework of gene-culture coevolution. And this is, I think this is the group out of Santa Barbara and Stanford, and they do this stuff with gene-culture coevolution, where they're looking at genes and culture, and they say that, different populations will, evolve, and they'll break apart, and they may or may not transmit the same cultural values. But you can trace, say, again, in this archaeological context, sort of an ethnic group and then a culture. And sometimes the culture will track with the ethnic group. Sometimes it'll significantly change with respect to the ethnic group. So there are different ways you can measure this gene-culture coevolution. Furthermore, you can have things like different adaptations that occur, like the ability to process lactase. And so this allows you to drink milk. And so we've sometimes been able to associate changes in the genome associated with that with cultural practices associated with certain ethnic groups and in different regions of the world. And so we can look at these kind of coevolutionary events. And so this is one approach to cultural evolution. So what they call the Californian school emphasizes how evolved social learning mechanisms and transmission biases, respectively, contribute to the stability of culture and the direction of its evolution. And so they use a very natural selection approach to this. So they use everything in cultural evolution is analogous to genes. Okay, so that's the Californian school. Then there's a second school referred to as the Parisian school, and these people are from Paris, so they're probably very familiar with this. So there's the Californian school, which is more about natural selection and cultural evolution. And then there's a second school, which is the Parisian school. And they've adopted this framework of the cultural attraction theory, or CAT. And so then there's a disagreement between these two schools in terms of the central role attributed to selection. So in the Californian school, selection is very important. In the cultural attraction theory, the Parisian school, selection is less important. The Parisian view is that it emphasizes how non-random transformations of cultural information during transmission events can explain how cultural traits progressively evolve towards stable forms, which are referred to as attractors. So the Californian school is very much driven by population genetics and natural selection. The Parisian school is driven by sort of these dynamical systems approaches, where culture is being driven into attractor basins, over time, and there's this trajectory that isn't really selected for. It's just driven towards a stable state. So this is kind of they break this down because they want to get a sense of, how if you're going to model cultural evolution with LLMs, what kind of approach are you going to use to sort of instantiate that sort of evolutionary stuff. So they're basically going to use cultural attraction theory and then do their study. So this is a figure here to show how these agents are organized. So there's this network of agents where they have these stories that they pass between one another. And then, this is the network, so you can have all sorts of biases in transmission. You can have changes in the transmission where the story mutates. And then, this is what, and then you can simulate this network for a while and figure out your final state. You can then define the behavior of each agent. So each agent has an input prompt. They generate a new story. And that story has, it varies between the first generation and new generations. So each agent is going to be able to generate a new story depending on its, sort of its input prompt, but also depending on its generation. So and then of course there are neighboring stories that the large language models might hear, that they might get that information. So you're training the model on some initial data set, but also on stories that get passed between agents. And then, of course, those stories can vary based on how they've been mutated. And then 3 is evolving stories across several generations of agents. So this is a crucial part of this, aside from having a population of agents, that those agents need to pass their stories down to new generations of agents. So basically, they're training the next generation of agent with their stories, both passing it down sort of maybe child-parent, in a way like this, or peer-to-peer, where neighboring agents are able to train the next generation of this black agent. This red agent is influencing the black agent. The black agent is influencing the red agent in the next generation. So there's this almost like this connectionist way of thinking about transmission. And then, of course, there's mutation. And then you end up in the generation N, which is the final generation, where you can observe this cultural evolution and how it's unfolded. And so they go through their study here. They have this similarity matrix, similarity graph, and then they can build these kind of measures like this set of word frequencies at each generation. So it's interesting to see that like some words persist across the evolution, like they evolved this for 45 generations or so. And so some words are used across all generations. Some words are used in early generations, but not later generations. And some words emerge later, like after 25 or 30 generations. Some words disappear and then reappear. And if you're familiar with some of the ways that they've measured cultural evolution in language, like the stuff that they've done with sort of n-grams and modeling n-grams. So Google has a site where they kind of have these, they've kind of taken their corpus of books that they have digitized, and they've broken it down into n-grams. And then you can look at the frequency of words in that corpus over time. So it's like, you have like the word boat, and you can look at how often it's been cited in literature over many years. And so that's what they're trying to do here. They're trying to get a frequency of different words across these corpuses that are built from these large language models and their interactions. So it's very, very interesting data here. There's a lot of interesting stuff in this paper. So this is, some of the stuff that they've done with cultural evolution in large language models. This is this graph blown up. So you have a lot of words here where, these are, again, these are built from n-grams. So n-grams are where you take all the words in a corpus and you break it up into like their syllables or words or fragments of different length. And then, you kind of query those fragments as words and you build a frequency graph from that. So you can do this with, actual words or made up words, just to see what those, because you don't necessarily know the context in which the words were used. You could use the word boat like in different contexts. Boat could be, say, for example, an acronym. It could be used as like the thing we know as a boat, or it could be a slang term that has nothing to do with the meaning that we generally use for it. And those can have different frequencies depending on the cultural context. So this is one of the drawbacks of this kind of approach, is that you don't have the context here, you just have the frequency of use. This figure is the similarity graph between successive generations. So this shows that, like, if you have these connected agents, that they're doing similar things in similar areas. So you can see, not surprisingly, the more connected you are to your neighbors, the more similar you are to those neighbors. And they just kind of show this as a function of connectivity. And again, you need to analyze the connectivity to understand this better, but it just gives some interesting detail as to how this transmission process works. This is their interface, so they can actually, again, model this as an sort of, by varying the parameters. You have the number of agents in your network, the number of time steps, you give some seed, and then you have this initialization prompt, this transformation prompt. So you're actually prompting the words at initialization, but you're also you're prompting a transformation. So it's interesting. So you're saying that the initialization prompt is a storyteller, you add an item. The transformation prompt is where you say, what kind of changes do you want to see? Minor changes, major changes, etc. The network structure is the way you visualize this graph. And then you kind of give, this is agent by agent breakdown of what's going on. So you can actually give the agents a personality. So you can say if it's very creative, not creative, etc. And so this actually plays a role in how the mutational process works. Because if you have a more creative agent, they might mutate their story more than a non-creative agent. And that, you can do this with other things, like if they're very traditional versus very non-traditional, and so on and so forth. So you can add a personality component to this. Then finally, there's this this is a paper where they talk about hallucinations in multimodal large language models. And the reason I bring this up is because in cultural evolution, you can have these hallucinations. And, maybe we can understand hallucinations a little bit better in the context of cultural evolution. So I bring this paper up just to give us some idea of what the state of the art is with hallucinations, with these kind of effects where if you're mutating stories, how often is it that you end up with hallucinations? And how often is it that you end up with stories that are basically consistent with the original story? So this survey presents a comprehensive analysis of the phenomena of hallucination in multimodal large language models. This is where they're incorporating visual information. So these are also known as large vision language models. So you not only have words that you're training it on, or some corpus of linguistic data, but you're also using vision, like image data and things like that. Or you could also use auditory data as well. So they use this class of model, which has demonstrated significant advancements and remarkable abilities in multimodal tasks. Despite these promising developments, LLMs often generate outputs that are inconsistent with the visual content. So as you mutate these stories, that's all well and good, and you can track that, and you can understand the sort of the cultural significance of that. But you also have these other modalities. In cognition, of course, we not only have stories that are told orally, but we have visual counterparts. And so that often gives us the context. And so now we see that, like, oftentimes, large language models that are multimodal, they'll generate outputs that are inconsistent with that visual content. So that's the way they define hallucination, and it poses substantial obstacles to the practical deployment of these models. So, people are trying to understand why this is the case. It's prompting efforts to detect and mitigate such inaccuracies. So they review this field to kind of get a better understanding of how this is how we can understand hallucinations and how these models behave. So we review recent advances in identifying, evaluating, and mitigating these hallucinations, offering a detailed overview of their underlying causes, evaluation benchmarks, metrics, and strategies developed to address, hallucination. By drawing the granular classification and landscapes of hallucination causes, evaluation benchmarks, and mitigation methods, this survey aims to deepen the understanding of hallucinations in these kind of large language models and inspire further advancements in the field. Through our thorough and in-depth review, we contribute to the ongoing dialogue on enhancing the robustness and reliability of MLLMs, providing valuable insights and resources for researchers and practitioners alike. So this is actually from their GitHub repository here, where they call it Awesome MLLM Hallucination. So if you go here, they have this survey, and this is their sort of, a comprehensive categorization of different types of hallucination. So you have different types. So you have hallucination causes, hallucination metrics and benchmarks, and hallucination mitigation. So causes being things like hallucination from data, hallucination from model, hallucination from training, and hallucination from inference or prediction. So this is really interesting how they break this down into different ways that you can have a model hallucinate, the different sources of error in that. Then there are these different metrics and benchmarks. So there are different types of metrics here, depending on, like general metrics, and then benchmarks like discriminative and generative tasks. And then we have means to mitigate this. So we can do things like introduce negative data or counterfactual data, or mitigate noises and errors in different ways. We can, use vision encoders or other types of modules to sort of mitigate, especially in multimodal models, this mismatch between the corpus of text and the image data. We also have training-related hallucinations, which we can mitigate with reinforcement learning, auxiliary supervision of different methods. And then mitigating inference-related hallucinations, we can do things like do interventions or post-hoc corrections. So that's really interesting stuff. They have this is a pretty good set of resources here. And then finally, this is the large language models culture repository. This is actually from the first paper, I believe, and this kind of talks about some of the things that they're doing in this first paper, where they're building this population of agents and they're introducing them to this corpus, and they're doing the mutation and all this stuff. So this is Jeremy Perez 2/LLM culture, and you can find that and look through that repository. Okay, so yeah, and then I think this is yeah. So any comments or questions on that?
Yeah, really.
Yes, broadly. I was just going to write this in the chat, but it's quicker if I speak.
Okay.
So how did you come across the cultural evolution paper? Because I was reading this paper not long ago. And as I mentioned in the ethics channel in Slack, I've become extremely paranoid about things coming up, that I have been working on elsewhere. So I need to know, how did you come across? What is your path to reach that paper? Is the machine spying on me, feeding data to each other? Is it by coincidence, or tell me? I need to know.
Oh, I just probably found it on arXiv, or like through the Flowers Group blog or something like that. I'm not sure.
Were you searching for? I mean, you do more, right? Isn't it difficult to know? Because I was specifically trying to write a paper addressing cultural issues using model cards, which is I'm following on because of a proposal that I'm going to write.
Yeah.
And so I remember distinctly thinking, I'm not interested in hallucinations for the same reason that I'm not interested in the pathology side of medicine or AI. But I remember this paper very clearly, and I'm very paranoid, and so you're confirming to me that there is a matrix of knowledge which I am too aware of. But anyway, thank you, because I hadn't had the time to read it. So at least you have me look at it now. Thank you.
Yeah. So, we've been interested in cultural evolution in the group before. We haven't talked about it so much recently, but we've done a lot of, participated in the Cultural Evolution Society conference. And so, this is something, it's kind of a long-standing interest in the group. We've done something like some cultural modeling and things like that. So that's actually something we should talk about maybe more too. It's like maybe I'll bring it up next week, some of the work we've done on that. So, but yeah, it's like an interest area, and I thought, okay, this would be interest to the group, kind of tied in with what we do. And
yeah. No, I love that, as well as how that kind of relates to some of the. I think of it as the earlier agent-based modeling work, but certainly like the Joshua Epstein.
Oh yeah.
Like Agent Zero stuff, where Anyway, I think it'd be Sarah's papers have been really interesting too. The things that she's been connecting that to. I dropped a link to Steve Hansen, who I think of as an old school AI winter neural network guy, who also just happens to be a director of a neuroimaging center.
Okay.
But they've got an upcoming workshop. Anyway, it's called Understanding LLMs Understanding.
Oh yeah, I think I saw that online. Yeah.
Okay, good. It was on Comp Neuro.
Okay. Yeah.
And also at it looks really interesting. Like I've certainly loved his work in the past, and now his students are doing cool things. But I also met with a UIUC student about their neurotech club.
Oh wow! Okay.
We should talk about that, because it was a good meeting, and I think he's a PhD student now. Okay. But he knows the club, is interested in doing more with Neurotech X, and just working on some cool stuff that we should talk about. But,
definitely, yeah.
That would be a bit more like foundation models of neuro data related, as opposed to this LLM. But I need to dig into. So you'll put all these in the notes to the YouTube.
Yeah. I usually put the list of papers in there. Okay. Yeah.
I know. Yeah. I'm gonna figure out how to scrape all those.
Yeah. I wish they allowed you to do better metadata management there, but it's like
Anyway.
Sorry, I have realized that these notes are already shared. And now I understand your process. Partly you take notes and you write them down, and then you put them down the videos. And this is why, having understood that, I think maybe my document is redundant. I hadn't seen them before. Although there are a couple that I captured that you may not have captured. So it could be scope for doing a bit more collaborative editing of these links. But thank you so much for sharing the resources, because it's so difficult to keep up with everything. It's useful.
Oh, yeah.
And again, it's past midnight here. Okay. And I've been thinking of logging off for at least an hour, but then I thought, I'll listen 2 more minutes. And then so thank you, everybody, and have a nice weekend, eh?
You too. Thanks for attending.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.